All right, let's start. I hope everybody had a good lunch. How do you guys feel? And gals? Right. How are the energy levels? Do you want to stand up a little bit and sit down again? Or you think you stood up enough? Right. I'm not going to force you any exercises now, but all right. So let's start with a fun fact. I'm not sure if you knew, but we humans make actually around 35,000 decisions every day. Most of those decisions are obviously unconscious decisions, but we are going to examine and look how we make significant architecture decisions today. So my presentation, for whatever reason, doesn't want to work. The clicker. All right. So, hello, my name is Vladas Diržys, and it's really a privilege to be here today. And before we go further, let me just quickly introduce myself. I come from Lithuania, work as a lead, or recently joined Autronica as a lead cloud architect. And Autronica is a leading global innovator in fire and gas safety, and where we are driven by a powerful vision: zero loss of lives, no injuries or damages caused by fire and gas. So a really powerful mission. And professionally, I'm interested in domain-driven design, event-driven architecture, or software architecture in general. And on a little bit lighter note, on my spare time, I like to play guitar, to the regret of my family, because I'm not really that good. And also, I think I'm reasonably good at Mario Kart, if anyone wants to challenge me. Right. So, while we are going to talk about decisions, let's first clarify what do we actually mean by architecture. So, one could assume that architecture is some fancy drawing of a diagram. And before I go further, I should also say that there are many definitions of architecture, what architecture is. And because I'm a presenter, I'm holding the microphone. So I choose my definition that I prefer the most. And yeah. So actually, I would put it very simply. Architecture is a set of decisions. And I like in Gregor Hoppe, in his book, The Software Architect Elevator, illustrates this with a drawing of a house. So even though it has many elements of a house, such as windows, door, roof, I think we can all agree that one would probably not expect such a drawing from an architect. But consider a similar sketch on the right now. And the sketch is still simple, and they look almost the same, right, except for the roof. And this house has a steep roof because it's designed for a place with cold winters and lots of snow. And a steep roof helps the snow to slide off easily. And then the roof overhangs, protects the windows because it stops the snow piling up in front of the windows. So what I'm trying to say here is that architecture is about making intentional and thoughtful decisions that shape a structure and function of something, whatever that something is. And also consider how we build houses around the world. We build them differently depending on the area where we are built, right? So the context of our decisions matters. And so the similar principle applies to our software architecture. It's our decisions must align with our specific context. And a context in which decisions are made determine whether these decisions are fit for purpose or not fit for purpose. And interestingly, it also means that there is actually no good or universally good or bad architecture. It's either fit for purpose or not. So I think we can all clearly see that the context of our decisions matters. However, it's also important to consider how we make these decisions. Are we always as rational as we think we are when we are making these decisions? And surprise, surprise, we are actually not. And there is this famous book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. I definitely recommend checking it out. And In his book, Daniel Kahneman talks about the two systems in our brains. And first of all, there is this system one. So it is fast, automatic, and based on intuitive thinking. You can also think, by the way, it's also prone to biases, this system one. And you can think of it as a car with an autopilot, right? And like a robotaxi or a Waymo. And then we have also a system two in our brains, which is opposite. It is slow, deliberate, and more for analytical thinking. But it's also difficult and uncomfortable to think in system two for more extended periods of time. And you can think of it as like a old car with a manual stick, right? So now, I mentioned this fun fact at the beginning. So we can't use system two for all the 35,000 decisions during the day. That would be madness. But we should try to see how we can engage system two, then making decisions with possible big consequences, such as significant architecture decisions. Right, now a question to you, the audience. Do you have less than 10 browser tabs open right now? Okay, I see at least one hand up, or two, right, 3, not that many. Also counting your mobile phones? Right, so I think we can all hear the answer. But if someone would still have your hand up, I would see David Beckham opening the door and saying, be honest. Right. But the point I'm trying to make here is that most of us have busy schedules, going from one thing to another, email or Slack notification popping up. So it is really challenging for us to keep up with everything in our brains because, first of all, our brains have limited working memory capacity, and secondly, we are constantly distracted by all what surrounds us. So our brains could use some assistance, could use some help. And scientific studies suggest that writing actually leads to better decisions. And this is because it helps clarify the thought process, enhances memory and reflection, reduces cognitive biases. Also, interestingly, it strengthens the commitment in the decisions because when we write our decisions down, we are more likely to remember them and more likely to follow through with a decision. So this is not only applicable for architecture decisions, it's generally good advice in our lives to write the important decisions down. Right, so much theory about architecture, decision making. Let's explore now step by step how we would write an ADR by going through a fictional decision together. And to set the scene, let's say we are starting a new project that requires a front-end framework. Right, and for that we need to choose a front-end framework. Does that make sense? Yeah? So I want to warn you before we start that right now you're going to see some text, and because that's what ADRs are, it has text. But you don't necessarily have to follow or read that text to understand what's going on. I will talk about it. But I just also don't want to skip that part from you or hide it from you. So, and here we see on the left side, we see the structure of an ADR. It's sort of a convention. It doesn't have to be that way. But it's also not necessarily the order in which you write the ADR. So if you see that we are jumping from one thing to another, don't be confused. So don't expect us to go exactly the same order as it is written here. So just a warning. So right, so let's start. So first of all, we have a title, which is brief and prefixed with decisions ID. And at first, we are having a generic title, choosing front-end framework. And also, we are going to come back to this in the end. Also, we need some metadata. So our status is going to be draft at first. So the statuses are rather self-explanatory. I don't really need to talk much about it, but I would just like to point out that we also have this superseded by status. And we have a status because the ADRs are immutable. Now, that's not to say that we cannot fix a typo in an ADR. We can. But if a decision changes, we want to preserve the history of previous decisions. Right. So if a decision changes, when we change the status of the old ADR to superseded by the new ADR ID. And after the status, we have a context. And as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, context matters. So here we are describing the problem we're facing, the constraints we are under, any relevant background information. So basically here we want to explain the most important forces affecting our particular decision. And let's write our context sort of together. So here we are saying that we are starting a new project which requires a front-end framework, right? And then we have some sort of requirements, high performance for mobile users, maybe some considerations, such as team's existing skills and familiarity with the framework. Right. And after we have our context defined, then we should also go and define our options that we can sort of think of, or the options that we think are most viable for us. And here the first option is not surprise to many of you, React. Here we are providing pros and cons for this particular option, defining those, thinking of those, and in our context, or React, I would assume everyone here in the audience knows what React is. I'm not providing a deeper explanation here, but there are various different decisions that sort of are not that obvious to the reader. And then in those cases, we should also make sure that we think of a reader if that option is really clear to the reader, and possibly provide a bit more text description or architectural diagram, or even a code example. So whatever makes that option really obvious to the reader. Right. So we have defined our first option. We need a second option. So let's say our second option is Vue. Also, I would assume not big surprise to some of you at least. Again, some pros and cons here. Now, let's say we are living in some alternative universe where we don't have that many JavaScript frameworks to choose from. We are going to stop here for the sake of time. And let's say now we feel confident in one of options that we already have defined. And this is not an uncommon thing because we are all human, we have our biases, and then we feel more confident about one option than the other. And as an optional step, we can go and advertise our thinking to later on in our decision-making process. And we do that by putting a selected keyword at the top of a title as a prefix. So this sort of advertises to the readers, to the people who are involved in our decision-making, what sort of our preferred option is. Right. So we have defined that option, and then we can also define already the consequences for this particular option. So here we are providing positive and negative consequences. And positive consequences is often very easy to think of, but I often see teams overlooking the negative consequences. And an important, significant architecture decision rarely has no negative consequences. And so by providing the negative consequences, we are telling to the readers that we are diligent in our decision-making, we are diligent in our thinking, and the positive consequences tells to the reader why are we accepting the negative consequences. Right. So here we can now go and say that we actually have a decision that we can propose. And at this point, we would go into our decision-making process. And there is no one and only decision-making process. Some organizations have it very strictly defined. Some organizations don't have defined anything. And so it varies from organization to organization, from team to team. Right? And in our case, what we're going to do, we are going to follow the so-called architecture advice process. And in architecture advice process, rather requires us to ask advice from people affected by the decision and people with expertise. And in our case, who could be people affected by the decision? Whom should we consult? So this was probably, yeah. Very well. Exactly. And then expertise, people with expertise. So these would be, the front-end developers could be either, actually both, people affected and with expertise, right? So, and that's what we're going to do. So let's say we are going to talk to Liam, our React expert, and he tells us that the React's performance can be improved with some skills, with some techniques. So he's not too worried about actually React as an option. And then we talk to Sarah, our front-end engineer, and she tells us that GitHub Copilot can write a lot of text, and so we might not be too worried about lesser-known frameworks, right? And then we talk to software architect David, and he tells us that our framework should be compatible with our existing design system. Now, I'm not sure if you followed, but nowhere in our decision before, in our idea before, we mentioned the design system. And this is because we didn't have that information in our, we just didn't know about it, right? And talking to people around us, people with expertise and people affected, right, helped reveal our blind spot. And we all have our blind spot, but we are just not aware of them. So, because we learn now about this design system, we are talking to design system product owner, and she tells us that the design system supports React and Svelte. So here I can also point out that we don't have Svelte as an option. Right. So we could go now and make a final decision, but we are, instead of doing that, we are still going to go back to an ADR and change our ADR a little bit, because we want to incorporate all the advice that we got from our advisors into the ADR itself. So first of all, we can go and say under considerations that design system support is required, and under options, under React, we can say that it is supported by design system. Under Vue, we can say that it is not supported by design system. Right? And also because we learned about, or not necessarily that we learned about Svelte now, but it was brought up during the advice process, it is fair actually to introduce Svelte as well as one of the options, because it seems that it should be a viable option for us if our company sort of invests in it somewhat. So we should consider it at least. Again, providing here some pros and cons. Right. And now we are ready to actually make the final decision. So, and our decision actually changes now because we learn new facts, and it is fair to also change the decision based on our new learnings. So we are choosing React. And after that, we also have to rewrite our consequences, because another option means that our consequences also change a little bit. Also, we can say that we made a decision and therefore decision is accepted. And the title can change now to a specific title. So to reflect the actual decision. And we do this because we want to be able to look at list of ADRs and know what the decisions actually are without having to go into each ADR individually, just to optimize that for the readers. Right? So we not only saw the structure of an ADR, but also went step by step how an ADR can be written and a decision can be made. And when it comes to the structure of an ADR, here we introduced two additional elements, the options element and advice element compared to the so-called lightweight template introduced back in 2011 by Michael Nygaard. And so I didn't really talk about the advice, and that's what we're going to do now. So first of all, I want to be clear. There is a difference between advice and an opinion. So when someone gives you an opinion, that person can tell you, I like A versus B, but actually what we are looking for is the why. So we want to know, why do you prefer A versus B? Right. So secondly, when we gather advice, we make naturally better informed decisions. So, and this is because advice allows us to reveal our blind spots, as sort of I tried to illustrate you in our previous example. Thirdly, when we gather advice, it helps to build trust in our decisions. And this is because we work in a socio-technical systems, right? It's also people who are involved in our organization, in our teams, and then when we collect advice, we allow more people or relevant people to be involved in this decision making and make their voices heard and matter, basically. So, and this is important, or it's important to say that it's also important to listen to advice. Now, I'm not saying that you have to always agree with advice. That's a different thing, but it is important to listen to it. And conversely, if we are gathering advice and actually not listening to it, it can have a negative effect, because then people in the end might not want to give you advice after all. We might not see the value in it. Right. So, and last but not least, so when we gather advice, it allows us to decentralize our decision making. Now, I didn't really talk about it when we actually made, or when we gathered advice during that ADR example, but actually we can allow anyone in our teams to make decisions, architecture decisions, even significant decisions, as long as these people seek advice from affected people and people with expertise. Right, and this is described in great detail in the book from Andrew Hermo-Law, Facilitating Software Architecture. I definitely recommend checking it out if you would consider introducing architecture advice process in your organization. So it has tons of great advice about it, and pun not intended. So, and by the way, the template that we just looked at is actually described in that particular book, although it is a little bit more opinionated in this book. Right. So, now a question to you. Did you ever have to communicate a decision to stakeholders outside of your team? All right, I can see some hands up. Now, is there anyone who didn't have to communicate a decision outside of your team? This number doesn't match. Is there anyone who would not raise your hand if no matter what I would ask? Right. Right, and so when we want to communicate the decisions outside of our teams, there's another template that I think is quite interesting and can be really useful sometimes, because it sort of makes our thinking very explicit. And I'll show you why I think that way. Right, and so this template differs not a lot. So it has one additional element, evaluation criteria. And then the options under the options themselves, we would do slightly different things there. And the consultation or advice changes name to consultation. But we are virtually the same thing. Right. And under the evaluation criteria, what we would do is we would define the criteria that are important for us to making this particular decision. And this could be any architectural characteristics or any constraints. Basically, anything that we think is really important for us to make this particular decision. And here I would say that also if you know about architectural characteristics, for those who are a little bit maybe more interested in architecture, there are tons of the so-called elitists, and not everything can be a priority. And you need to choose something that's really important for you and your organization. So it's, again, your particular context that matters when making this decision. And here as an example, I'm basically showing what we can choose for this particular decision that we looked at before. And when we go into options, then we can evaluate each of the criteria and give it a score. And in the end, we can have a total score, and sort of also we can also have trade-offs on the side. And evaluating options in such a way enables us to, in the end, compare the total scores for each of the option and make a decision based on which option has the highest score. And also, it makes communicating the decision with our stakeholders easier and transparent. Right. So this should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. So it is important to remain pragmatic. So the best template is still the one that fits your needs. And whether you stick to the lightweight template or the extended one or something in between, so make sure that it's not some burdensome task. Right, so I can see your faces. You're thinking, Vladas, you've been talking for now 30 minutes and you haven't mentioned generative AI yet. Don't worry, we'll fix that now. Oh. So, there's the saying, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And it is still important for us to remain in the driver's seat when we are using our coding assistants and coding agents. Also, what we know is that their AI really thrives when it has the correct context, when it has good context. So, and also ADRs can be actually a great source for that particular context for our coding agents. And here I'd like to just illustrate this with, or show you how, as an example, how you can do that. So imagine you are exposing your ADRs over MCP if your ADRs are not, let's say, hosted on or not in the same repository as your code base. And then you can just very simply import that MCP server or allow your coding assistants or coding agents to talk to your MCP server. And in your coding assistance instructions, you would tell that, hey, look at our ADRs, our decisions before you do anything. And then if you have a decision like this, for example, here I have a decision, we'll use AWS app config feature flags for feature flag solution. And then you go and ask your coding assistant to do something related to that. It will go and will search for relevant decision and find the relevant decision for this particular feature that we are building, and also go and implement what the decision actually describes. So now this is a small example, but it's sort of an illustration that how you can still remain more in a driver's seat when using coding assistants and coding agents before fully surrendering to vibe coding. Right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits that you will get out of ADRs. So first of all, ADRs improve our decision making because they help clarify not only our thought process, but also our decision making process. So we have sort of a little bit more structured way in which we make the decision. So, and we also make better informed decisions because of that. Secondly, because we gather the ADRs over time, we act also as a historical record of how our system evolved over time. And what were the reasons for these choices. So it can be very easy to criticize a system when you're joining a new company. And so when we do that and we don't have these ADRs in the decisions, we just simply don't know the context why the system is as it is. But these choices could be really the best course of action given the context that that particular company had at the time. And thirdly, when we write ADRs, this also improves our communication, not only within the team, but also with our stakeholders outside of the team. So, because when we can transparently share all of our decisions with them as well. And so related to that, ADRs also make, as I mentioned, decisions transparent, again, because we capture the why of a decision. And think of the times when a decision was possibly made and maybe you or your colleague were not in the room. How could you have affected that decision? Maybe you felt that your voice was not heard or someone else's voice was not heard during that decision making. And then it's very difficult to affect decisions afterwards. But with ADRs, when either you can see the reasoning for yourself, why this actually was decided this particular way, or you might even be able to affect that particular decision. Or, as we've seen with the superseded, that the decisions can be superseded, then it sort of provides you the vehicle how you can change these decisions in the future. You might want to introduce a new ADR to change that decision. Right. So, before I leave, I would like you to leave you with some actionable advice how you can get started with ADRs if you haven't yet. So, first of all, consider thinking of any past decisions that don't have an ADR yet. Capture those decisions, backfill the recent decisions. Then, what you can do is then start just simply noticing when a decision is made or maybe just was made, and either create an ADR yourself or ask your peer for an ADR. And if you are in a leading role or an architect role, and you have maybe already meetings where you talk about architecture or talk about decisions, consider talking about ADRs in those meetings. You can ask, hey, do I have an ADR for this particular thing? Then also consider introducing the architecture advice process. And so introducing ADRs does require a cultural shift. And a cultural shift requires time. But we also know that culture can be changed, and the best way to change a culture is to actually lead by example. And because you are attending my talk, I expect you to be that example to to the other people in your organizations. But I want to warn you that, first of all, patience is key in this process. But the good news is that you don't need anyone's permission to get started. Just do it. Just write your first ADR. And before I leave, I would like to leave with one question. So when you're going to make your next decision, will you write an ADR? Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. All right, over here. I think you know what the answer is. It depends on your particular circumstances. So this is a fairly frequent question, I would say, and my answer to this is it depends on who your audience is. If your audience are product owners who don't have access to your code repositories and you want feedback from them, then it doesn't make sense to put all these decisions into, let's say, code bases. So I would recommend, so what we are doing, we are putting the decisions in Confluence, as simple as that. So everyone has access to it, although there is a downside to it. It's not as easy then to put a decision down, put there as a developer. So yeah, it's a trade-off. Yeah. I haven't used this for this particular example, so I must admit I don't know. I don't see the use case for this. But I mean, if you are storing your ADR or your ADRs in a code repository, then well, you could use the same process, but it's about slightly different thing. Peer reviews are for code quality, but ADRs are for the decision itself. So I would probably not consider joining these things. Yeah. So first of all, how much time? So definitely it varies, but and you have to be really careful because there's also this thing called analysis or paralysis by analysis, and not to fall in this trap. You have to be careful and have to sort of push because it's very easy to fall into this trap. So being aware of it is good, and having someone sort of pushing for a decision is also something that I would advise to make sure that it's better to make a decision. It doesn't have to be perfect. Let's make a decision and let's move on. And that's where also this architecture advice process really shines, because it allows many more people to make decisions and not being dependent on one single, let's say, ivory tower architect. And your second question was at which SDLC step you would do it. It really depends, because there are different type of decisions. If you think of different type of decisions as sort of a pyramid, there are some decisions that are made by developers, some decisions that are made maybe by some architects, even could be on a higher level. Then, so the higher level you go, the sooner in the process it probably would be made. So if there's a decision that we are going from AWS to Google Cloud, then it probably will be at sooner point rather. Later one. Yep. So as I mentioned during my presentation, we don't want to change the existing decisions because we want to preserve the history. We want to know how the system evolved over time. what we would do, we would introduce, if a decision changes, we're introducing a new ADR, and then we are changing the status of the previous one to superseded by that new. Yep. Any other questions? You don't, ADRs are a very free form thing. If whatever makes sense to you, you don't need anything other than just editor. So it could be Markdown, it could be Confluence, whatever, it could be Word, whatever works for you. So what I would do is I would group them depending on the domain or per domain or per team, whatever your structure, whatever makes sense for your particular structure. But maybe having a set of ADRs for maybe higher level and then per domain is something that we've been doing in the past and also would recommend to others because sort of it makes sense to split them a little bit. So just to extend a little bit on that, what we have is a prefix that's saying that sort of ADR, domain, slug, and then ADR ID. Yeah, so I think if you have just one option, then you were really not doing a good enough job because there is always a second option. And the second option is not do anything. If you're proposing to do something, there's also a second option, not do anything. And then you can compare against that. So one option is too little. Optimal number, 3, 4. 5, maybe a little bit getting too much, but I've been there. Right. We are out of time. Thanks a lot for coming for my presentation.